All right. So here we are again. Let's talk about bee photography. Okay, and there's an image of a little bee inside of an aperture. We might recognize that symbol from the inside of a fancy camera. All right, so what we're going to explore today, what are we going to do? What's in it for you? You're going to find out who I am. We're going to talk about the challenges that are unique to photographing bees. We're going to talk about the challenges that are unique to macro photography in general, and kind of segue that into camera platforms, choices, benefits, and drawbacks. I'll give you some random thoughts about photography, and then hopefully there'll be some time for question and answer. Hopefully all your brains won't be fried by the time I'm done talking, because there's a lot to photography, a lot. All right, so who am I? This is a picture of me from years ago, actually. That's me with a bee, specifically Bombus melanopagus, whatever you want to call the bee. And it's sitting on my thumb. And that's my Japanese Pieris in the background, which is still that same exact size, because every winter it gets frosted out, and good golly, I need to dig the thing up and put something else there. Somebody's got to have a recommendation for me. All right, so I live in Tenino, Washington, which is a little town south of Olympia in the South Puget Sound. I live on some acreage out here. Got a big garden. I'll show you pictures of that in a minute. I am a board member and a founder of the Washington Native Bee Society. Sometimes I wonder if I am first a gardener or am I a bee enthusiast? I'm both. But I kind of go back and forth as to how I want to introduce myself to people. But to all of you, I'm a bee enthusiast. But as many of you know, it's my garden that I can't ever stop really talking about. So my first encounters with plants and bees, I grew up in Chicago, around the tallgrass prairies of Illinois. I was just back there last week, and there's just nothing that gets my heart racing like being on those prairies. They're like nowhere else on earth. 6-7 foot tall grasses with flowers just everywhere, and bees, and it rains in the summertime, which is always, it wasn't fascinating to me when I was a kid, but now it's fascinating to me, of course, being in the Pacific Northwest. Obviously, I have a strong interest in native plants. My favorite bee is Andrena prunorum. I think that's a lot of people's favorite bees. Lots of people's favorite bee, because it's just beautiful. My favorite flower is Phacelia heterophylla, which is nobody's favorite flower, except for mine, because it is the most amazing bee plant you could ever plant in your yard. So plant it, get some seeds, find some seeds. They're not hard to find. Grow them, plant them, enjoy. I have really stubby shaped thumbs. I don't know if that's really important information, but if you ever see my thumbs, you wonder what the heck's wrong with that guy's thumbs. But I figure that I put that in there. No one else has got thumbs like mine. It's my day job. What's that?
I said mine are.
Oh, yours are stubby too?
Sorry, Joe. Go.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So my day job. So obviously I got to fund my garden and my photography somehow. You don't do it by liking bees. And my day job is I'm a teacher for the Washington State School for the Blind. All right. I'm also the author, creator of the recently published Native Bee Diversity of Washington State poster. A little nod out to the bees in your backyard. For I took their style as an honor to them. But we are in the midst of revising this poster to publish again in a couple weeks with more bees from the east side of the state. Right now, it's just got a heavy bias towards the west side, but we're kind of rush publishing it. We'll get an alkali bee on there because that's super important, right? Most famous bee in our state, most famous native bee probably. And we'll change up one of the bombuses and clean some of the pollen off the diadasia on this picture. But anyways, we'll get that out to you, and hopefully all you can have a copy at some point. That's all my photography. All right, this is my garden. Wow. And this is my garden as it is about right now. Of course, this is my garden as it is right now. Of course, on the left picture, that's actually my garden right now last year, but it's very similar. This year, it's just I didn't have a cloudy day where I could photograph it, where everything would pop out. You can see my daughters, 7 and 5, Lillian and Andrea, right out there enjoying the prairie. Clarkia is in bloom. Clarkia is awesome. If you want to see really cool bees in your yard, just plant lots of Clarkia. It's easy to grow, rip up your lawn, put some seeds down, good times. Once again, there's my gardening part. I'll talk to you about my garden forever. You can see in other pictures there, I got lots of different ornamental plants. You see a bee hotel in the background, huge bee hotel presence in my yard, thousands, actually tens of thousands of nesting reeds and holes that I have built over the years. And then down at the bottom is a greenhouse with the tarweed in bloom very early this morning when I started to make this presentation. I took that picture. All right, so let's talk about over the years, my history as a photographer. This is my first picture of a bee I ever took. It's June of 2000, the Little Red Schoolhouse in Palos, Illinois. I was Eastern Carpenter bee on Buttonbush. And I took it with an old Minolta HTSI 2 35 millimeter camera, film camera. And it was a very special picture at that time. I had no idea what the future would hold for me because 19 years later, here's that same type of bee. But obviously you could see the evolution of my photography over that time. Actually never took a bee photo between this bee photo this in 2000 and then 2013. That was the big gap where I never took a bee photo. And so pretty much everything I do now has been something that's happened since the last, 7, 8, 9 years now. Okay. Lisa Robinson and I took an adventure out to the alkali bee beds. This is me when I go out into the field. I'm a little gear heavy. One of the funny things we like to joke about with this picture is that somehow I was grabbing all my gear and I brought a shoe with me up onto the bee beds. I don't know, you just keep grabbing stuff and eventually you get a shoe out of it. So that's what I do. But it's not just me who's out there photographing bees. It's all sorts of people. It's everybody, maybe even everybody on this or here watching right now has dabbled at least a little bit into bee photography. We all have our ways of going about it. It's kind of intimidating to give this presentation because I'm talking amongst a bunch of photographers and people who have their own ideas of how to take a bee their own way that they like. And I'm going to hopefully give you a presentation that's fair and talks not just about what I like, but some of the benefits and drawbacks of using different kinds of equipment and methods. And well, we'll get into all that. But anyways, here's Lisa. She is photographing some penstemon with her iPhone 13 with a macro mode that she despises. This is somebody that Lisa gave me the picture of. I don't know who this is in the middle, but she's using an iPhone. It looks like Kylie. She's using an iPhone with a clip-on lens, clip-on macro attachment, I'm assuming. And over here we got Elise, and Elise has a fancy setup where she's got an EOS R with a 100 millimeter lens, 100 millimeter L series lens, and she's photographing in her world famous Seattle front yard, which is extraordinary for bees. Maybe she'll invite you there someday. All right, why we all love photographing bees? Why do we do it? Why do we spend the time? And I put a picture in here. It's not my picture, but it's a picture. Once again, it's Lisa's. Obviously, I hang out with Lisa a lot. It's the most beautiful bee picture I think I've ever seen. I can look at this photo for hours, and I just love it. It's done in natural light during that horrific time in September of 2020 when we were all smoked in, and that natural light kind of offers a little silver lining to it all. It's a Andrina on rubber rabbit brush. And gosh, someday I'm going to get the full file and I'm going to print this out. I'm going to put it on my wall. Anyways, why we love photographing bees? It's the era we live in. Bees are having their day. I mean, bees are really popular these days, right? It reminds me kind of like of when bats went from being hated and they were going to be in everybody's hair to being universally loved. Bees are, they were never really hated, right? But most of the bees in the world were pretty much ignored. And now it's like, wow, there's a whole lot of information about them. There's field guides coming out all the time, good field guides. And it's just a really neat time to be a part of that. We do because we like to share images with others. We love working for a cause. A lot of us in Washington Native Bee Society aren't just here to talk to each other, but we're here to make a difference with bees. And part of making that difference is showing our photos to other people and getting them interested in it as well through that. iNaturalist posts, once again, that connection with other people is really important. And then also learning about what we're seeing. So photographing, then posting, then getting others to comment on it. bees, photographing them makes their features accessible. Really, they're just kind of little blurry, fast moving fuzz balls when we're out in our garden. But taking our camera to a bee and getting a solid photo really allows us to take a long look at the creature and really marvel for its features. All right, some people like the hunting aspect of it, the thrill of the chase. I kind of like that too. I love it when a bee is not cooperative. It really challenges me to do something out of the ordinary or come up with some sort of way to photograph it. I can't stand failure, so I just work and work and work for it. So that's really big to me. And then most of all, really, gosh, I hope most of all, actually, bees and flowers are just an irresistible combination to look at. You're really not just photographing a bee when you're photographing a bee. You're photographing a bee and a flower. It's like a double subject thing. It's like a clownfish and an anemone. This is symbiosis in action, and it's just gorgeous. I think in the notes for this talk on the website, I wrote that this is the inspiration, got to be the inspiration for almost every magical fairyland that you see in art, because it is like that. When you get down to that level of the bees and the flowers and the bees are absolutely beautiful creatures with beautiful proportions and all that, and their wings beat just like fairies, and it's just really fascinating to look at. And so there's probably countless other reasons that everyone else has too. Those are just the reasons that I could come up with off the top of my head. So if you haven't photographed a bee, I'm going to tell you what it's like to photograph a bee. If you have, you probably understand some of what I'm going to talk about. So this is this morning when I got up, once again, got up early to make this presentation and went out to the thistle patch in my meadow. And I stopped dead in my tracks because look, there's a male thistle longhorn bee, and I want to take his picture because he's rare in my yard. In fact, I was on a board meeting last week for Native Bee Society, and I was asking everybody, please tell me if you have a male thistle or if you have a thistle longhorn bee in your yard. I'm going to come photograph it. Well, sure enough, the next day they show up in my yard. So I've got now thistle longhorn bees here. And so there's a male. So I want to go take his picture, but all right, before I do it, this is what's going through my, before and while I'm doing it, this is what's going through my mind. What kind of bee is this? Oh, it's this one, longhorn bee. Oh, what do I know about this bee? Yeah, it likes asters, likes thistles, likes to get its head deep into the thistles. What does it spook easily? Absolutely. This thing spooks really easily. The males spook easily. The females don't. The males are really uncooperative. You got to really dedicate your time to it. Where is the sun? Oh, good. It's behind me. All right, good. I like that. I like when the sun's behind me. Where is my shadow? Don't want to get my shadow over the bee. If I get my shadow over the bee, that bee's going to spook. What's the temperature? Is the bee super hot? Yeah, it's early this morning. It's this morning, today, 90 or 80 degrees already at that hour in the morning. That bee is supercharged. Where is the bee now? The bee's on the flower. Where will it be 3, 5, 7 seconds from now? Got to know that info. All right. How should I approach this bee? It spooks easily. All right. How is it using the flower? It's going round and round in circles, spending about 11 seconds on each flower. Then it's moving for about a minute, and then it lands again on the flower. All right. Was it behind? What is behind the flower? Ooh, that's a huge part of bee photography. What's behind the flower? What is behind me? Another huge part of bee photography. How am I blending in? How can I sneak up on this thing? Is there a big solid object behind me that I can just be a part of and the bee doesn't see it? Can I shade the bee? Can I shade this bee? How can I shade this bee? Can I immediately stick my camera right in its face and cast a shadow on it? Or can I shade it from a few feet away first and then slowly move my camera towards it? That's eventually what worked. Any chance I can grab hold of the flower to manipulate what's in the background? No, it's a thistle. I cannot do that. Is my flash on? Oh, but going back to that, actually, I do that a lot too. I hold my camera in one hand, and the other hand, I manipulate the flower and twist it and move it whichever way so I can get a favorable background. All right. Is my flash on? That's how many shots I've lost when I haven't turned my flash on. All right, what in the world will I be stepping on? Ruined part of my meadow doing this actually today. Shoot, I'm gonna need to lay down. My elbows hurt. This thistle is embedded in my arm. How did I get upside down? I might be here for a while. Did I put sunscreen on? Yeah. All right, and then whatever else might happen when you're photographing bees. I was yesterday, I was out with my family on a whale watching boat out of Anacortes, and I was taking a picture of a humpback whale, and I thought, good golly, this is easy. I just stand here, and the whale comes up out of the water, I point my camera, and I shoot at it. There was nothing to it. There was nothing like this. Um, Photographing bees is a complicated thing. All right. And so this is the product of all my labors. This is the product of that, of all those questions right there. And that is that male uh, Melisodes, whatever, the thistle longhorn bee. They're really big and they're really skittish. And there he is, just kind of about to depart the flower. Got that photo. All right. So bees are challenging. So what makes shooting bees unique and challenging? I kind of revealed a little bit of it there. These are tiny subjects, okay? So with major features that are beyond the resolution of our eyes. Photographing them requires really close proximity. There's constant, rapid, and unpredictable movements on vegetation blowing in the wind. Like I said, it's two subjects we're photographing at the same time, the bee and the flower. They dwell in areas lower or higher than human head height. That's big. It's really big. Makes a big difference in getting a photo. A lot of humans just kind of like favor head height. You always can tell a really skilled photographer from a not so skilled photographer because this not so skilled photographer is the one standing up in their usual standing up position. Even when you're taking wedding photos, a skilled photographer will crouch down, work with the background, get on up, maybe even prop themselves up a little higher, angle the camera in certain ways where they can get just the best shot. Okay, and of course, these bees also dwell in areas with low light. We'll talk a lot about that in the coming slides and the factors that deal with light and macro. So what makes shooting macro a challenge? The biggest thing I hear from people and the biggest thing I struggle with myself is that with macro photography, you have a very, very narrow depth of field. We'll talk more about depth of field, but you know, when you see, we've all watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, probably, at least those of us of my age and up. You know, the beginning of Mr. Rogers, there's this little town where the front and the back are out of focus. Okay, and that kind of cues us in that it is a miniature town. Anything that we see in the miniature, the front and the back are very much out of focus. And there's usually a slice in the middle that's in focus. That's the depth of field. We'll talk more about that. I'm not going to beat that too much right now. All right. So photographing a smaller subject or a smaller area generally means there's a lot less light to work with, even on a day when it's super bright and sunny. It is, it's kind of confusing actually how that works, but usually when you get up really close to something and you're only photographing like the head of a thistle flower, there's not a lot of light there, even if it's getting baked in the sun. All right, so camera equipment often needs to be specialized or modified to produce good results. So you got to be a little crafty with what you're working with. Some popularly marketed macro equipment can be remarkably unfit for the job. Maybe we've all gone out and bought something or are thinking about buying something that might not actually, when we use it or have used it, do the trick very well. We'll talk about that. All right, there's so much to cover when it comes to photography. This is my list that I made of like presentations I could do a whole day on. Like I could talk for 8 hours in each one of these 10 areas, probably even longer than that. I even gave them little icons too. You like what I gave for depth of field? Submarine. All right, so you know, I was thinking like, where do I start? I got an hour, maybe an hour and some change to talk. And so what everyone seems to want to talk about right now is, or anytime, just to get things started, is platforms. Like what kind of gear are you going to use? And what are the benefits and drawbacks of gear? And I think that can act as a catalyst for further conversation into some of the particulars and uniqueness of macro photography. So let's talk about platforms. All right. This is a comment that I get very often. Maybe some of you get it because I know there are some really good photographers out there. These photos are great. You must have a really nice camera. How does that make you feel as a photographer? Is any other art like that? You know, like, does anybody tell Van Gogh he had a really great paintbrush? No, I mean, the answer to this is that, yeah, I got a nice camera. Yeah. Okay. But I know how to use it. All right. Really nice camera. Does a really nice camera, quote, really nice camera, always equal more money? Marketers would like us to think that way. Canon, Nikon, all them would probably like us to think all that way. I don't know. Well, I'll let you discover as I go in and talk about the different slides. All right. Just to clear out the elephant in the room, you're probably all wondering, you've probably seen my photography and you're probably wondering, well, what is my rig? What do I use to shoot? All right. So this is a picture of my rig. It is a Canon EOS 90D body paired with a 60 millimeter f2.8 EFS macro lens. I have a very inexpensive 270 EX2 flash on it. I have on the very front of the lens a peculiarity. It's just kind of a weird thing I always use. It's a Raynox DCR 150. It adds another half bit of magnification to it, which actually centers the subject right in the area where the most potent flash is. Kind of discovered that over the years, and so I can get a sharper photo that way. I have a plastic sleeve that was cut off of an Office Depot folder with a paper towel inserted in it, and then a cardboard backing with that I have glued a reflective, like from Joann's, little reflective sheet of paper to. That's Velcroed onto the back of the flash. And that's most of my photos that you see are shot with that. We'll go into more depth with that later. All right, so let's talk about setups. All right, so this idea that the more money you spend, the better the photo you're going to get. Let's talk about these. I'm going to give you some examples. This is shot with my main setup right here. This is a small carpenter bee, Ceratina species, on a pearly everlasting flower. I heard you guys talking about pearly everlastings in the bee get together earlier before I started talking. This bee was photographed with a total of $1,800 worth of equipment on there. And for those of you who want to go into understanding how I took the photos, I've left the metadata on the side for you if you want to try to imitate that with your own rig. It's an $1,800 rig. All right, this is a $200 rig. And this is a Raynox or a Lumix FC50 from circa 2007 or so. You can get it on eBay for about 50 bucks. I have the Raynox snap-on lens attached to the very front of it to make it a macro lens. And then I crafted this really junky felt diffuser onto the top of it. Shot it in f10 with ISO 400, 1/200 of a shutter. It's got to just use the built-in flash. Yeah, that's not too different from the $1,800 setup. That's that setup again, a little closer. You can see a little bit of my garden in the background. The Coreopsis is in bloom right now. The Zagreb Coreopsis, great bee plant. Great bee plant if you have no other greater bee plants nearby. Ignored if you have greater bee plants nearby. All right, this is a $3,000 setup that I may never use again, but just for the sake of talking about something that's more expensive than my regular setup. This is a male bumblebee on Monarda citriodora, a beautiful flower that only attracts male bumblebees and lots of wool carder bees. Don't plant it in your yard unless you're just obsessed with beauty. The total cost of the setup's $3,000, and that's because look at all the flashes on this thing. It's got 3 flashes happening. That's a lot. That's overkill. It's not really needed. Back then, when I took this in 2016, I thought that was a good idea because marketing had gotten to me about the amount of flashes I was using. I'll talk a little bit about multiple flashes further on in this talk, but I think you get the drift that I'm not a fan. Anyways, took a nice picture here of this bee, and it's shot with the 35 millimeter Canon STM lens, one of my favorite macro lenses. You can see the background that's in there. That's butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. That's that setup up close. Very heavy. All right. This morning, I decided to try my hands at natural light bee photography, something I almost never do. And that's so that I could talk about it with all of you. So I took out my big lens and I snapped it on my big camera, and I went to town with it. There is a female of the thistle longhorn bee. And she doesn't spook very easily. I was able to just creep right up on her and just let that shutter roll. This is a $4,500 setup with natural light. That's that up close. You can see that I've got that lens attached to an extender, 1.4x extender. I've got 50 millimeters of extension on it to allow that lens to focus even closer than it already can. That's a 7D Mark II camera body. All right, this is my $150 setup. This is the least expensive. This is an iPhone. I took this morning too. Obviously, my thistle is my center of interest. Never mind the bull thistles. That's my logo in the garden. Let the bull thistles grow. It's probably not a good thing. It's probably like, yeah, well, Kate Walker will scold me for letting them grow, right? She's the botanist.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
All right. I am trying to replace them with Western thistles. Just my Western thistles, I can't quite get the right rhythm on getting them to grow. I get them to germinate, but then they're less than vigorous about their growth. All right. So yeah, so this is an iPhone with a Moment 25 millimeter macro lens, which is attached to the macro case that has the mount on it. I also held up a little sheet of plastic that was somewhat translucent and kind of diffused the light so that it wasn't so much beating down on the bee, and I could have that more kind of semi-cloudy day look to it, which I find attractive. And that's that setup up close, the lens screwed onto the iPhone. All right, so choosing a rig. Let's talk about what, here we go. Let me actually, oops. All right, so where to start? Sorry, I had to rearrange some stuff on my screen. So camera brands and types. There's Canon, there's Nikon, there's Sony, there's Fuji, there's Panasonic, there's more. All right, these are all the kind of the facets of different things to look at when you're looking at cameras. You know, there's different companies, right? We all kind of have our favorites. There's this, and within those companies, there's different sensor sizes. This is important stuff. There's full frame, which are usually the flagship models, APS-C, micro four thirds, bridge cameras, smartphones. All of those have different sensor sizes, and that's important. We'll talk a lot about that. The type of camera, DSLR, or more recently, mirrorless. Mirrorless is kind of taking center stage. Lenses, we'll talk about telephoto, mid-range, wide angle. There's a lot of weird lenses too out there, especially with macro photography, whatever you can imagine, really. Light, do we want to use natural or flash? And then post-processing, there's some options there, lots of options there, really. So let's start with camera brands and types. All right. All manufacturers really have a wide range of cameras with various abilities. I obviously am a Canon guy. Canon seems to be popular with wildlife photographers, maybe because of marketing. And when you open up National Geographic, you cannot miss the Canon ad, wildlife as Canon sees it, right? And so that has paid off for Canon with our kind of people. But really, Canon, you know, is great, but you can probably get the shot you want across any brand you like. Canon has an advantage of their native lenses, their actual Canon branded lenses. They have over 200, around 250 of them. So really, with Canon, if you can dream it, it's there. They've made it. Sony has about 40 lenses. You might be doing some dreaming with Sony. Nikon has about 100 lenses. Of course, all camera brands have the third-party lenses available for their mounts. These are the Tamrons, the Zeisses, the Sigmas, and more recently, a Chinese brand, Laowa, which has been creating some really fascinating lenses for macro photography. And you can get those for just about any camera brand. Bridge cameras, which is like the Panasonic FC50 I showed you, that's a bridge camera. It's kind of all in one. It has the lens built into it, but it looks kind of like an SLR camera. It looks like a professional camera. You can't interchange the lens. They have similar, bridge cameras have similar features across brands, but there are a couple bridge cameras that are particularly good for macro photography, like the Sony Cybershot and the Panasonic FC1000. The reason for that is because of their manual focus ring. You really aren't going to do well with macro photography unless you have some ability to focus with a manual focus ring. Smartphone cameras are, and of course, smartphone cameras are more based on your preference for whether you're an iPhone person, Android person, or whatever the other operating systems are, if there are. I assume there are others at this point, but these cameras are advancing really fast. But you may want to steer, if you want to do some macro work with it, steer yourself towards a camera with the a phone with the lenses in the corner of the lens. It's really hard to like take a Google Pixel camera and take a macro photo with it because the camera lens is right smack in the center of the body of the phone, and so that casts a big shadow on your B, whereas the others, being in the corner of the phone, will allow the light to hit the B. Okay, so choosing a sensor size. Okay, so we talked about the brands, and within those brands, they have a lot of different sensor sizes that they offer. Well, not a lot. There's really two main big competitors, and then there's a lot of notables. And we'll talk about the two main big ones for the most part, and then give some mention to the notables. All right, the sensor. So what is a sensor? The sensor is when you take the lens off, it's that little square or rectangle you see in its place. It takes the place of film. It's in cameras, cameras of antiquity. I came up with that this morning. COAs, film cameras. So and it senses the light and sends that light to the SD card that records it. Okay, so there are many different sensor sizes. There's full frame, which is the fancy flagship ones, APS-C, MFT stands for micro four thirds, 1 1/8, and smartphone sensors, of course, being just about the smallest sensors that we would ever use for B photography. So generally, the larger the sensor size, the larger the physical size of the, just a second here, actually, I've got to rearrange something on my, here we go. All right. Oops. I have to rearrange my screen a little bit here so that I can read everything that's on it. Okay, great. So sensor size is bigger, better. Generally, the larger the sensor size, the larger the physical size of each pixel, and the more light can be collected accurately by the camera, so the richer the image quality, which is why those big full frame cameras are the flagship ones, because they take gorgeously wonderful pictures. But there are trade-offs that are significant, especially when it comes to macro photography. All right, so let's give you a couple sensor size rules. Sensor size rule number one, there's two that I'm going to give you. All right, so giving cameras with different size sensors, all equipped with the same exact lens, and the subject, the B, is at the same working distance, the B will fill up a greater area of the frame with a smaller sensor camera. So a smaller sensor camera means more B, a larger sensor camera means more background. These are sensor sizes compared. So here you have a picture of a little sweat bee on a Rocky Mountain columbine. And you can see that you get a whole lot of columbine in a full frame picture. You get a whole lot less in an APS-C. In a micro four thirds format, the B is actually occupying a significant quarter of the image. Okay. Imagine if all those sensors were the same pixel density, which they usually are. So let's say they're all 24 megapixels. So you're going to get a whole lot more pixels on that B with an APS-C or a micro four thirds camera than you're going to get with a full frame camera. You're spending your pixels on the B with a smaller sensor size. You're spending your pixels on the background with a larger sensor size. Sensor size rule number two. To make the B appear of equivalent size in a larger sensor camera versus a smaller sensor camera using the same lens, working distance must be reduced. This closer working distance also reduces the depth of field. Depth of field, I mentioned that as a big conundrum when it comes to macro photography. So here we have it summarized. Smaller sensor equals more space between you and the B and more depth of field. Larger sensor equals less space between you and the B and less depth of field. This is an example of depth of field. It's talking about Mr. Rogers in the beginning with the blurred out foreground and background. So depth of field example, I love this photo, but one thing I don't love about it so much is that softness on either side of it, the foreground and the background. Really, all that's in focus is a slice of the right side of its eye and its thorax. That's it. All right. So that's kind of a small depth of field. That's f13. So um, I'm trying to avoid actually getting into the exposure triangle part of this conversation because I think that's a whole huge presentation as is. So I'm doing my best to avoid getting too much into like what f13 means or ISO means or shutter speed means. There'll be times I touch on it, but just know that f13 is a depth of field amount that should amount to a lot of depth of field. Okay, and that's really all you get. It's like a millimeter. All right, so let's take a look at depth of field for APS-C. So depth of field is the width of the area in focus from the front to the back. This is my little graphic of the camera. You can see like a DSLR camera image. I hope that it looks like a DSLR camera from its profile angle on the left side. And you got the B, and you can see that as it says aiming at the B, there's a strip, a couple millimeters of sharpness right there, and then its wings either side of that are blurred out. Okay, but if we are going to use a full frame, look at that. If we want to fill that frame with the B to the same percentage of pixels that are on the APS-C sensor camera, we have to move that camera up. And so that sharpness area reduces by the physics of light, it reduces its width. Okay, so APS-C, we can stand back a little bit more. We can spend our pixels on the B a little bit more, and we get a greater depth of field. With a full frame camera, we have to get up really close, more of a chance to spook the B, less depth of field, more blurriness. Okay, and all that for, I don't know, well, for a lot of money for a full frame camera, right? All right, so focus stacking. Just this little side note about focus stacking. Many of you have probably heard of it. You probably saw my poster. You noticed that maybe you noticed the bees were all in focus from the very tip of their antenna to the very tip of their tail. Focus stacking was invented, I believe, in actually Ukraine, and in the 80s, and it's allowed us to kind of skirt some of the limits of the physics of light and the small depth of field. This is an example of focus stacking done in the hand. This was taken in Elise's amazing front yard. This is 6 photos deep and combined then in a program called Helicon Focus, which is out of Ukraine. Support them. It's a great product. If you ever get into focus stacking, maybe I'll do a presentation on focus stacking someday. I love it. Of course, you need a still subject for that sort of thing. This is a focus stacked picture from the poster of Androidpreneur, my favorite. This is, of course, my favorite color version of Androidpreneur. They come in all sorts of colors, and this all orange variety is just awesome. All right, so let's go back to our full frame APS-C conversation. So full frame cameras, what is a full frame camera? The Canon EOS R series are full frame cameras, except for the brand new R7, which is an APS-C. The Sony A7 is a full frame. The Nikon Z6 is full frame, plus many more. Those are about the most current full frame cameras that are out there selling lots. All right, so what are the benefits of full frame? Okay, so they're generally better performance in low light, but not always. You get less noisy images. Noise is that kind of like oddly colored pixels that seem out of place when you're taking a low quality photo in low light. Many other types of photography benefit from full frame. So you can use it for wedding photography as well as beef photography if you'd like, and do pretty well with it. Drawbacks of full frame, they're usually expensive. I mean, we're talking thousands of dollars more than smaller sensor cameras. They have a reduced depth of field due to having to bring the camera closer to the subject, as I discussed. And to mitigate that, you have to use a larger, heavier lens to compensate for that close working distance. So you don't have the option to use that 60mm lens like I have, that really small one, where I can hold the camera comfortable in one hand. You usually, to compensate for that that working distance, you need a longer lens with more magnification, which means heavier. So APS-C. So examples of modern APS-C cameras are the EOS R7, the 90D, which is what I use, the Sony a6600, the Nikon Z50. The benefits of APS-C are increased working distance, increased depth of field. You put more pixels on the B. They're usually less expensive. Many new APS-C cameras have almost indistinguishable low light performance between them and full frame, and they can use smaller, lighter lenses more effectively. The drawbacks are that the images can be noisy in low light, and they're less useful for other types of photography, but that's really kind of a matter of personal thought. If you know what you're doing with photography, you can make just about any size sensor work for almost any task. All right, sensor size in smaller cameras. So when we talk about smaller cameras, these are the notables. These are the like bridge cameras and iPhones. It's not that war between APS-C and full frame, really. So sensor size in smaller cameras can also be a bonus. In fact, it can even like a pretty small, like micro four thirds or even the 1 1/8 sensors on bridge cameras can be really awesome for macro photography because you really are applying a lot of pixels to the B. They can come up with like some significant trade-offs and other features. Like you can't interchange lenses on them. You get the lens that's built in, but so you can't like change them for creative purposes. You have to do other things to adapt them, like snap on the macro lens in front. And sometimes that's not really conducive to getting a good photo, depending on what kind of setup you have. They lack important features too, like high frame rates and accurate focusing, and they have large viewfinder and shutter lags. So these aren't the professional camera bodies that you find in those fancy Canon and Nikons. So full frames and APS-Cs can have some really, they're almost identical camera bodies with identical features. They just have different size sensors. All right, so since smaller cameras use different lens systems than pro style cameras and often not interchangeable, comparison can be complicated. It's an apples to oranges sort of thing, really, with smaller sensor sizes. But know that they can be useful at times. I mean, you saw that photo of the FC50, 15, 17-year-old camera, whatever, 16-year-old camera, taking a pretty decent photo of that metallic green bee that I showed at the beginning. All right. Nowadays, all the talk is DSLR versus mirrorless. DSLR and mirrorless. What is DSLR? What is mirrorless? Okay. Since digital photography became common, camera makers, when they did the switch from film, they just swapped out that area that the film was passing through on the back of the camera with a light sensor. That's it. The mirror stayed put. That mirror reflects light into the viewfinder so that you can look through the viewfinder and see what's happening at light speed. All right. Most camera makers have stopped the evolution of DSLRs. You're just not going to see DSLRs coming out anymore. So that cameras with mirrors, they pretty much Canon stopped at the 90D, and that's where it's over. And Nikon stopped at whatever was theirs, and it's over. It's all the Z series now. I mean, they're still going to be out there, but you're not going to see newer models released with mirrors. Okay, what you are going to see are these mirrorless cameras, which have removed that mirror, and so now light passes through the lens directly onto the sensor. There is no mirror in the way, and what this great benefit is or what this allows is you to see a really accurate preview. Well, or preview. Accurate's kind of subjective, but a preview of what the image is going to look like through the viewfinder or through the LCD or the screen on the back. So if you are shooting at a shutter speed that's not going to allow a lot of light in the camera, you're going to see it, the image portrayed through the viewfinder as being very dark. Whereas if you were doing that same thing with a camera with a mirror on it, or DSLR, which stands for digital single lens reflex, by the way, which doesn't make any sense to me. And I've been shooting photography since I'm a little kid. Single lens, I guess the mirror reflexes up or something. What you would see through a DSLR was just an image, right, of light just hitting the mirror, and you would have to kind of in your mind imagine what the picture might look like. Okay, you have to do some estimation. Of course, as you use a camera more and more, that estimation becomes easier and easier, but there's a process to it. Whereas a DSLR kind of bypasses that whole process and shows you what you're going to get before you even press the shutter button. All right, so DSLR versus mirrorless. Let's talk about something that's related to DSLR versus mirrorless that is enormous and totally untalked about when it comes to shooting bees and macro photography. This is something that, gosh, it's like the first thing I look for when I'm going to buy a new camera: latency and shutter lag. What is a product of latency? Okay, just keep this image in mind. This is a product of photographing with a very latent camera system. There are 3 latencies involved in using a DSLR. All right, there's this moment of decision where your brain decides it's going to press the shutter button. That seems like it doesn't take time, but it does take time. Then your brain has to send a signal to your finger to press the shutter button. Once the shutter button is pressed, that signal from the shutter button then takes time to activate the shutter. Okay, that is a moment of time where you've had an in-focus bee suddenly become out of focus because these bees move at warp speed. Mirrorless. Mirrorless sounds like this is a great thing, except it adds another layer of lag. Anyone you can take out your phone right now, turn on your phone camera, which is essentially a mirrorless camera, and wiggle your fingers right on the other side of that camera. Point the camera at your fingers, wiggle them. You will see that camera's viewfinder shows you something that's happened in the past, a few milliseconds in the past. Same thing with a mirrorless DSLR. With a fast-moving tiny subject that's on a fast-moving flower, that makes a huge difference. Okay, so you've added that now to the moment of decision to press your shutter button, and the time it takes your brain to send signals to your finger, and from the signals to get from the shutter button to activate the shutter. And you're going to get a whole lot more of this. All right, so is mirrorless better? Well, certainly you're going to have to change your shooting style. You're going to have to predict more. There's ways around it. And you can see my last bullet point right here. I say latency drawbacks can be overcome by predicting behavior. All right, so it's not a good thing. So anyways, let's talk about this a little bit more. Viewfinder latencies increase with demand on image previews. So the more you put demands on it, so the higher the ISO you use, the bigger the features you use, the slower that latency is going to be, the longer the latency is going to be. It's best to use your camera in optical viewfinder simulation mode, which still has a lag to it, but not as much lag to it. So really, your mirrorless excitement about previewing your image is negated with beef photography. If you can't tolerate the latency, or if you don't want to tolerate the latency, if you want to take less photos of a bee flying away that's blurry. All right, so electronic viewfinder doesn't simulate. Also, if you choose to use a flash, which I'll get into later, the electronic viewfinder doesn't do a really good job of simulating the effects of the flash. Right? Unfortunately, we'll have to adapt sooner or later. Don't know. One of the things about mirrorless, which is actually kind of nice, not kind of nice, but super nice, is that DSLR lenses, your old lenses, are all going to work with on whatever platform you evolve to. Maybe you've already evolved to them, but you can use old lenses with them. That's good. So there's some bonuses too. The new camera bodies and lenses with mirrorless can be designed to be smaller and lighter weight, which is really nice. And so technology with mirrorless is evolving very fast, right? It's likely to work out its drawbacks, but it's not really going to ever deliver you that image at light speed like an optical viewfinder would. All right, we'll move on now to lenses. I love lenses. I love collecting lenses. Sometimes I realize I have lenses that I forgot I had. Buy old junky lenses on eBay. It's just fun to have a new piece of glass. All right, so there's so many lenses to choose from. The most popular macro sizes are around 100 millimeter. I know a lot of folks, several folks here shoot with 100 millimeter lens. That seems to just be the one that's marketed a lot. It seems to fit nicely within the range of working distance and lightweight. That's good. They're good lenses. So let's talk about lenses and what's going on with lenses. The more millimeters the lens has, the greater the magnification, the greater the working distance. All right, so 1:1, when you see a camera that has a 1:1 ratio on it is a macro lens, which means that the B will render its same size on the image sensor when focused at its closest point, or otherwise be life size. All right, so that B is going to show up on your sensor when you're focusing at its closest point. So you've turned that focus knob all the way to one side. That B is going to show up and imprint on that sensor the same size that B is in real life. It would be like laying that B right on the camera sensor. All right, some lenses are super macro and produce images greater than life size, like the Canon 65 millimeter MPE. I'll show you some pictures from that. The Laowa 25 millimeter 2.5 to 5x. Okay, there's that Laowa name. If you get really into macro photography, you'll probably get into knowing a little bit about Laowa. These days, they made quite a splash. Non-macro lenses can be converted by using extension tubes. It's a really inexpensive way to take that lens you already own that's not a macro lens, snap on a few extension tubes, and suddenly, voila, you got a macro lens. It's probably pretty good. So wide angle macro, which is becoming, I think there's a lot more products out for it, and maybe a little bit more awareness to do it. It's kind of fun. It provides an interesting perspective that includes the background and habitat. I'll show you some images, examples of that. And smartphones and bridge cameras, when it comes to lenses, they're all going to require an add-on lens to achieve macro status. So for my iPhone, like I showed you at the beginning, I used a Moment 10X for smartphones. For the bridge cameras that I've used, like the FZ50 that I showed you earlier, I used the Rainox DCR 150 or the DCR 250. Those are those nice snap-on lenses. All right, so let's talk about millimeters and lenses. So here's two examples side by side of a B I put on a pin this afternoon in the hot 100-degree front yard of mine on my patio, and tried to line up a photo to show the difference. This is with the Laowa 15 millimeter 1:1 macro. And there's the Bombus Vosnesenskii. Look at the background. You can see that there's some California poppies back there. You see the poppy's leaves. You see a little bit of the railing near my front door. Actually, still above my front door, above its left wing. When I up those millimeters to a different lens, a 35 millimeter lens, you can see that now that bee is almost surrounded by that California poppy. The big difference there. Okay, and of course, if you start to add in the 60 millimeter lens, which I use frequently, you're going to see that that bee is almost completely, like the background's all poppy. And with a 100 millimeter lens, definitely, it's all poppy. Okay, this is the Canon MPE 1:5x 65 millimeter. And this is the eye of a Coelioxys or Coelioxys, or however you want to pronounce it. The cuckoo leaf cutter bee. It's got best eyes in the business. All right, now that's a focus stack picture, probably about 15 photos. But you're getting every lens in such detail and every hair on that eye. And that's because that lens does a lot greater than 1:1 magnification. It does 5:1 magnification. So we go 5x. And so you can get really close. And now this is cropped picture. It can't really get that close and fill its frame. This is maybe like a quarter of a frame. And anyways, it's neat. This is kind of my new fun thing, Canon 8-15 f4 fisheye, and I smack a 12 millimeter extension tube onto it, and so I can get really close. So I'm taking a standard lens, it's not a macro lens, and turning it into a macro lens with an extension tube. This is on some large flowered catmint or catnip, nepeta, whatever you want to call it, in my front yard. And that's Bombus flavifrons. You can see how the what I was aiming for and what I ended up getting was that wing wrap. You see how that wing wrap sort of complements the fisheye effect of the background. You see those Douglas firs kind of curling up there. See those leaves kind of curling up on that plant. Everything kind of suggests this sort of upward uplift movement. There's that part of the art in it. This is the Moment 14 millimeter fisheye iPhone 12. This is a really great macro lens, actually. It's not the dedicated macro for the Moment company, but it's a fisheye lens. So it's a super wide angle lens, but you can get some cool shots with it. You can kind of see that fisheye effect of the forest, once again wrapping up into the corners. It's kind of this effect that everything's rising to some vanishing point high up in the sky. All right, so lenses are kind of cool. There's a lot to say about lenses, but know that there's a lot of creative opportunities out there, especially if you shoot Canon. All right, so lighting. Lighting is a big deal. All right, natural versus flash. So natural lighting versus using a flash. So I know a lot of people shoot natural. I know a lot of people shoot with flash. I personally shoot with flash. So both approaches, natural lighting, flash lighting, both have their merits and can produce wonderful images. Most people I know shoot with sunlight for simplicity and to capture a natural scene. So what the bee is actually looking like, unmanipulated. Using flash in productive ways can be counterintuitive to available equipment and marketing. I'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so natural light. What are the benefits and drawbacks of natural light? Benefits of natural light. The bee looks like what a bee looks like. Bees spook less using natural light. It's easier to work from a greater distance because you're not casting a shadow over them. There's less weight to use in the field, and sunlight is completely free. As of now, we'll see what things are like in the future. But right now, it is gratis. The drawbacks of natural light is it usually requires using a high ISO settings, which kind of, I don't want to get too much into ISO and all that stuff, but the higher the ISO you use, often that has some detriment to your image quality. Using natural light produces high contrast and dark shadows. Generally, images shot with natural light are less sharp. It might require a diffuser sheet to soften harsh afternoon light. Like I used the diffuser sheet to shoot that iPhone photo I showed you in the earlier times, or the earlier part of this talk. And natural light is dependent on daytime. It seems like a silly thing to say, but a lot of good bee photography actually takes place at night when you find a bee that's really sluggish and it's fallen asleep on a flower. Can't do anything with it at night with natural light. All right, the benefits of using a flash. I'll give you some examples of these in a minute, but I'll just talk about this stuff and put that in your mind before you see my examples. All right, the benefits are that it produces more even lighting on the bee with subdued contrast. Flash results can produce some sharp images, really sharp. It allows you to capture fast action at low ISOs, slow shutter speeds, and small apertures. If you know anything about ISO shutter speeds and apertures, that seems an improbable thing, but I will explain it. The drawbacks of using flash is sometimes awkward to use a diffuser. It's a big, clunky thing that gets in your way between you and the bee. Flash is not free. There's more batteries to keep track of. Creates heavier weight to your rig. Sometimes you need to use a complicated bracket setup to use it, and the bees spook more easily. All right, so let's do a comparison here. So this is this morning. This is that thistle leaf cutter, or that thistle longhorn bee. Gosh, I love these bees. They're so cool. You can see those pollen hairs from like a mile away. You just know it's this bee. They just stand out. I shot it with natural light. Okay, so let's take a look at this image for a moment. See the features you see in it. See the thistle. See the background. See the sharpness. See the what the eye looks like, especially. Oh, yes, bee photography. The eye. Eyes always got to be in focus. Always got to aim at the eyes. Always got to aim at the eyes. All right, this is the same species with a flash on the same type of flower. So look at the flower, look at the features, look at the hair. Most importantly, look at the eyes. Okay, so look at the eyes on the natural light. Look at the eyes on the flash. Look at the sharpness on natural light. Especially look at those pollen carrying hairs on the hind legs. Look at those hairs with the flash. Okay. Here's natural light. Same bee species again for consistency. Let's look at those eyes again. Look at that sunlight beating down oppressively in the center of that eye, burning out the pixels there to a point where you can't manipulate that in post-processing. There's no information left there. It is simply just a white image. All right. Look at the eyes on the flash. Soft and gentle. Harsh. Okay. So here we go. These are my settings that I used for this. All right, what is the great benefit of flash? All right, there's flash. Let's talk about this great benefit. Besides aesthetic, depending on what your appreciation for aesthetics are, whether you like natural light or flash for whatever reason, the great benefit of using flash is that it's fast. All right, so you're gonna look at my settings here, and I have 1/60th of a second shutter speed. That's really, really a slow, long, open shutter speed. To freeze action, like in if you're shooting at the Olympics in a race, you need to shoot at least like 1/2000th of a second to freeze the action of a marathon or a sprinter, if not more than that, actually, maybe 1/4000th of a second. So here I'm shooting at 1/60th of a second. What's going on? Why isn't this bee just a blurry mess? It's because the great benefit of a flash is that it records, your exposure records the duration of the flash, and really just the duration of the flash. So if you keep your shutter open for 1/100th of a second, or in the case of that longhorn bee, 1/60th of a second, what it's really recording is that 1/4000th of a second that flash is illuminated. Zap. So suddenly you're able to capture all that sharpness with that quick zap of the flash. And you're able to leave your shutter open for a really long time, relatively long time, right? It's not even an eye blink, but photography terms, that's a long time. And so this diagram is going to talk about how actually when you're using the flash, there's an interplay between natural light and the flash. So this is my camera setup with my big diffuser that you saw earlier. All right, you've got this diffuser, you got the SLR with the flash now mounted on top of it. There's my big paper towel plate that I have attached to the lens and then Velcroed to the back of the camera. All right, and you've got the bee, which is being shaded from the sun. So the bee is being put into a lot of darkness. So that darkness isn't going to expose very well. What's going to happen is the flash is going to reach that bee in the foreground and only affect that bee. And that 1/100th or 1/60th of a second that shutter is open is going to affect all other parts of the image that are not hit by the flash. So it's going to affect that background. So the bee in the front remains evenly lit. The bee in the front remains with a nice softness on the eyes, while the background stays true to the background for natural light. The background could be blurry for all we care, right? Even if, so the shutter's fast and your shutter's slow, so it could blur it out and it wouldn't make really any difference. It actually probably look better. So also to note too, if you're looking at this setup, that I have a lot of space between the flash and the diffuser. A lot of times companies will try to sell you a little plastic thing that goes on the end of your flash as a diffuser, and you're going to use it as the diffuser, only to find out that you don't get those kind of eyes that you just saw in this picture. You get eyes that look more like that with it, and that's because flashes need to breathe a little bit between the flash, the light bulb and the diffusers. They need to scatter a little bit, and so that's that space. So create a little space and things will be better and softer for your flash. So there you go. That's the benefit of using flash. You can capture fast motion, you can get even lighting, and you can still maintain a nice background. And there you go. There's my setup that I use. You can see that there's the flash with the space between the flash and the diffuser, and all the reflectors and everything like that. Yep. So there's that image again with those eyes and that sharpness. Okay, so I talked about how some camera gear that's marketed heavily for macro photography is not always great. One thing that I find macro photographers doing a lot, I run into a lot of people who go out and they buy a twin flash because it's like the most expensive flash and everybody says it's great for macro photography. All right, twin flashes. Check out this picture with the twin flash. It's a leaf cutter bee of sorts. And I've shot it with a twin flash, particularly the Canon MT24EX. And look what's done to the eyes. Okay, the lighting's kind of even, but suddenly like there's two suns on Earth. And we live in some sort of really weird land, like the Dark Crystal or something like that, where there's different suns floating around the Skeksis castle. You know, it's it's just kind of weird. And so when you do use a twin flash, think about that double light on an eye. Almost, I think for someone who's really freshly looking at a bee too, that it kind of makes the eye more complicated than it really is, and offers an extra feature that doesn't seem to make sense subconsciously to the mind. I do my best to avoid twin flashes now. This was my last real twin flash setup I ever used. It's really three flashes. It's really a tri-flash. Really, I have all the flashes aimed at one diffuser so that they diffuse into one point of light. And it was just a lot of overkill. I could get the same results with one simple flash mounted at the top of the camera. All right. Just kind of finishing this up as post-processing. Post-processing means what you do in your computer after you've taken your shot, after you spent your day in the field. All right, so post-processing is the way you organize, share, and refine and enhance your photos. So your Cadillac post-processing system is Adobe Photoshop Lightroom with Adobe Photoshop. There's just nothing like it. It's pretty awesome. I mean, there's some drawbacks. There's some things it doesn't do where you got to get some other stuff, but really I haven't found much that competes with that. An inexpensive but very capable alternative. And when I say very capable, I should really underline that. Affinity Photos, like $50 at most. They have sales where they sell it to you for $20 for a lifetime license. You can get it on your iPad, you can get it on your Mac. I think you can get it on Windows now too. And Affinity Photo is great, especially for focus stacking. If you get into that, Affinity Photo is wonderful. So there's other alternatives such as like built-in Apple Photos, Microsoft or Apple Photos, Instagram filters. You know, everywhere you go in this world, it's all about sharing pictures, and there's ways to edit those pictures in the process of sharing. If you do get into focus stacking, like I mentioned before, check out Helicon Pro. It's great. If you really get into photography and you want to do some photo enhancement with AI, the Topaz suite is something I use quite a lot. So those Topaz Sharpen, Topaz Gigapixel, if you're familiar with that stuff, those are really wonderful programs for making your photos look the best they can look. All right, so this is what I have to say that now we've considered all the gear. Is what really matters most. You know, maybe I'll have the honor of being able to talk to you again about other, a little bit more or less general idea of photography. But what I think really matters most in bee photography is the person who is really controlling the camera and their knowledge of the bee's behavior. That person's ability to manipulate light, their craftiness in adapting their rig, changing things up, making a diffuser that works for them. Physical mobility and flexibility. This has got to be one of the most physically demanding types of photography out there. Bees are not at head height, and you got to get down low. So you also got to get dirty. So you got to be tolerant for getting filthy some days. And just talk about tolerance. You got to be in love with that direct searing sunlight at your back all the time. And that's what gets you successful at beef photography. And with all that knowledge and all that know-how and all that will and grit, you can make just about any system work. And the best advice, gear advice I can give after I gave you even more gear advice there is get yourself a really good pair of pants. It is absolutely indispensable and be the most valuable tool in your kit. I prefer the Stretch Zion Pant 2. I wear pants all the time, even when it's 95 degrees, because my knees will hit the ground and I'll get really embedded in the ground. I got all sorts of potholes in my garden from my knees, and the Zion pants just hold up really well. So yeah, pants. Go for it. All right, questions. There we go. We'll open that up.